In recent years, military analysts have been sounding the alarm about the rising threat China poses to the US concerning dominance at sea. It's certainly true that, in many respects, China has rapidly closed a previously cavernous gap in naval power. By leveraging its oversized manufacturing capacity, China's Navy, the Plan, now has more hulls on the water than the US and is outproducing the US by a significant distance. But there's one maritime area where there's no debate about who has an unassailable advantage: submarines. And the winner in that category? The US. So let's take a look at why the status quo in the ocean depths remains so heavily tilted in the US's favor, and why that ultimately makes China powerless against the US Navy. For starters, the US still holds a significant numerical advantage in this category. As of early 2026, the US fields a total of 66 submarines, all of which are nuclear-powered. China only has 12 nuclear-powered submarines, plus at least 46 conventionally powered diesel-electric submarines. Nuclear-powered submarines are, of course, vastly more capable than diesel-electric submarines, operating with far greater range, stealth, and offensive power. So, while China may have almost as many submarines, the US's nuclear fleet offers a much broader mission profile and, as we'll see shortly, infinitely greater destructive power. On top of that, the US's submarines combined have around 1,168 vertical launch systems, or VLS, for launching missiles. But, as we mentioned earlier, the gap between the two fleets is closing. According to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, China surpassed the US in annual production of nuclear-powered submarines between 2021 and 2025 for the first time. During this period, China launched 10 nuclear-powered submarines, totaling 79,000 tons, compared to the US launching 7 submarines, totaling 55,000 tons. In the previous 4-year period from 2016 to 2020, the US produced 7, while the Plan only produced 3, underscoring the size of the swing in production volumes. But the baseline numbers don't tell the whole story. They rarely do. Of the US's 65 active submarines, 14 are ship-submersible ballistic missile nuclear submarines, or SSBNs, and 51 are a combination of ship-submersible guided missile nuclear submarines, or SSGNs, and ship-submersible nuclear attack submarines, or SSNs. China has just 6 SSBNs and 6 SSNs. Now, if we ever arrive at the catastrophic eventuality of a full-blown nuclear war, that difference will prove crucial. For true nuclear deterrence, long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, are what are required. By placing nuclear-armed ICBMs on SSBNs in strategic locations anywhere in the world, a nation can ensure the ability to launch devastating retaliatory strikes, even if everything on the mainland has been destroyed. The thing is, China's 6 SSNs can't fire ICBMs, or rather SLBMs, the submarine-launched equivalent. SSNs are designed for tactical, not strategic missions, and are primarily equipped with conventional cruise missiles and torpedoes, not ultra-long-range, ultra-heavy nuclear missiles. That severely limits their range and usefulness as nuclear deterrent compared to SSBNs. And China's 6 SSBNs simply aren't enough to cover all the world's oceans, even if they were on a par with the US's SSBNs, which, as we'll see shortly, they aren't. Now, submarines, especially large, technologically complex SSBNs like the US's Ohio class, require extensive maintenance and ongoing mechanical finesse. Of the US's 14 Ohio class SSBNs, 10 to 12 are typically operationally available at any time. Each has 2 crews, blue and gold, that rotate on 77-day patrols, followed by 35 days in port. The fact that the US has 14 at its disposal allows practically continuous at-sea deterrence, with 4 to 6 SSBNs usually deployed globally at any given moment. China submarines face the same requirement for lengthy dock times in between deployments, so it likely only has 2 to 3 submarines operationally active at any moment. Take them out, and China's undersea nuclear deterrence is a thing of the past. In addition to the twofold advantage it has in numbers of SSBNs at sea, the US also has one or two of its Ohio-class SSGNs at sea at any given time. These have the remarkable ability to remain at sea for extended periods. One SSGN, the USS Florida, famously remained at sea for 727 days, just short of 2 years, via crew rotations and overseas resupply. Now, the difference in numbers doesn't just give the US a substantial advantage over China in the number of locations from which it's able to surreptitiously attack. US attack submarines also wield far greater firepower. China's 6-type 094 or Jin-class SSBNs can carry up to 12 SLBMs each, giving a total capacity of 72 simultaneously launched SLBMs. Each SLBM is estimated to carry 3 to 5 nuclear warheads per missile. That gives China a total SLBM payload of between 216 and 360 nuclear warheads. By contrast, the US's 14 Ohio-class SSBNs can carry up to 20 Trident II D5 SLBMs each. They were originally intended to carry 24 SLBMs with multiple independently targeted warheads, but the number was reduced under the terms of the New START Treaty. That treaty was controversially allowed to expire by President Donald Trump's administration, despite attempts by Russia to extend it, while a new deal could be thrashed out. With the US under Trump seemingly having ditched the notion of arms control altogether, perhaps we'll see the SLBM carrying capacity of the US's SSBNs increase in the near future. However, for now, the subs can carry 20 Tridents each. Each Trident II D5 missile can carry up to 8 independently maneuverable nuclear warheads. However, current loadouts are estimated at 4 to 5 warheads per missile for operational and treaty compliance reasons. That means the US is fielding between 1,120 and 1,400 nuclear warheads at any given time, 3 to 4 times more than China. So, just in terms of the numbers, China would have to double its SSBN fleet and quadruple its firepower to match the US. Which means they'll need to greatly increase their number of nuclear warheads. China's stockpile of nuclear warheads is estimated to be 600 to 700. Experts predict that number will rise to around 1,000 by the end of the decade, but that's still way short of the US's stockpile. The US has an estimated 3,700 nuclear warheads available for use. Discounting the 1,477 that are in the process of being dismantled, the US has an estimated 1,770 nuclear warheads deployed and a further 1,930 in reserve. Only Russia has more, and not by much. It's a very big gap for China to catch up, but they're trying. Now, some experts predict that, given its great advantage in shipbuilding capacity, China will achieve numerical parity or even superiority in this regard within the next decade. China is estimated to currently have 230 times the shipbuilding capacity of the US, with the gap widening by the year. But just because you can build more submarines, it doesn't mean they can compete. You can't buy experience, and the US simply has much more of it. The current fleet reflects decades of engineering prowess and strategic foresight, anchored by an all-nuclear-powered arsenal that dominates the underwater domain. The fleet today consists of cutting-edge Virginia-class SSNs, aging but still world-beating Ohio-class SSBNs, alongside a small number of the exceptionally advanced Seawolf-class and a large force of aging Los Angeles-class boats. Brand new state-of-the-art Columbia-class SSBNs are in development, with the lead boat now expected to be delivered later this decade. As we've discussed, the Ohio-class subs carry up to 20 Trident II D5 missiles, each with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, capable of striking targets 7,500 miles away. The Virginia-class, now rolling out its Block 5 configuration, integrates an 84-foot Virginia payload module, boosting its Tomahawk capacity to 40 missiles per boat. That's an immense amount of heavy-duty firepower, but it's their unrivaled technology that really sets them apart, particularly with respect to stealth and acoustics. The Virginia-class employs pump jet propulsors and anechoic or echo-free hull coatings to achieve noise levels below 100 decibels. That's practically ambient ocean-level background noise. that makes it a ghost to even the most sensitive hydrophones. But on the other side, it boasts an AN/BQQ-10V sonar suite, paired with large aperture bow arrays and the TB-29A towed array. It can process acoustic data with such fidelity that it can distinguish a submarine's shaft rate tones from whale calls at ranges exceeding 50 nautical miles. China's submarines simply can't match their US counterparts' level of performance, and that's not likely to change soon, but they're trying. China's Type O-93B submarines have progressed from their noisy O-91 Han-class predecessors, incorporating shaft dampening and a teardrop hull to dampen noise down to a respectable 120 decibels. The Yuan class goes a step further, leveraging air-independent propulsion or AIP to achieve noise levels around 110 decibels. Its anechoic tiles, reverse-engineered from Russian Kilo-class designs, also dampen sonar returns somewhat more effectively than older models. The bottom line is that US submarines can still detect even the quietest Chinese submarines at significant ranges, often before being detected themselves. China's underwater detection capabilities, while improving, still lag behind in range and fidelity. Now, in a clash of submarines, detectability is inversely proportional to survivability. Put more simply, if you can be heard, you can be hit, and vice versa. The US's technological superiority means that Chinese submarines are simply much easier to find and hit, and China is, at this point, powerless to do anything about it. Now, if fact-filled reporting and analyses on military affairs are what you're after, you're in the perfect place. Subscribe to The Military Show to keep your finger on the pulse of the most important military stories and what they mean. The underwater advantage provided to the US by superior sonar and sensors is compounded by the superior network interoperability of the US fleet. The AN/BYG-1 combat system aboard Virginia-class boats fuses data from a wide range of sources, including satellites, MQ-4C Triton drones, and P-8 Poseidon aircraft, enabling more informed targeting and mission planning. This gives US submarines a decisive edge, allowing them to operate with far greater situational awareness than their adversaries, even if real-time updates are constrained while fully submerged. This deep connectivity extends to carrier strike groups, where submarines act as forward scouts. Here, their task is to relay encrypted radio frequency communications via their OE-538 mast to cue surface assets like Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. In the South China Sea, this networked approach allows US subs to coordinate with anti-submarine warfare or ASW helicopters, dropping AN/SSQ-62 sonobuoys to triangulate Chinese submarine positions. In so doing, the US Navy compensates for the region's shallow, sonar-scattering waters, which might otherwise complicate submarine operations in shallower waters significantly. More about that shortly. But this advanced level of interoperability and multi-domain dominance speaks to the US's incomparable experience in submarine warfare. While the US has been refining these kinds of tactics and techniques for decades, nations like China are only starting to develop them for the first time now. Again, it's a question of experience, which must be earned, not bought. The US mastered anti-submarine warfare during the Cold War, decades during which China was gripped by extreme poverty and its military was in tatters. For the US, tracking threats from Soviet Alpha and Akula-class submarines across the Atlantic's GI-UK gap demanded innovations like the SOSUS hydrophone network and extensive training. Crew skills in interpreting faint tonal signals among dense thermal layers were honed at long-established facilities like the Naval Submarine School in Graden. The Graden School was established in 1916. That's 110 years ago, highlighting just how long the US has been a master of the submarine game. Several other submarine training facilities have subsequently emerged, in particular the Naval Submarine Training Center Pacific, or NSTCP in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the Submarine Learning Facility Norfolk, or SLFN in Norfolk, Virginia, and the Trident Training Facilities in Kings Bay, Georgia, and Bangor, Washington. A new submarine workforce training center is currently under development in Danville, Virginia. By contrast, China has one primary submarine training academy, the Naval Submarine Academy, or NSA, in Qingdao. It was established in 1953. almost 4 decades after the US's first submarine academy, although in recent years it's undergone major expansion, including a new campus opened around 2016. The net result is that China was very late to the game compared to the US, and is still very much playing catch-up. The average Chinese submariner today has around 10 years of experience, while in the US it's 15 to 20, and that experience has added up. By the end of the Cold War, the US had achieved more or less complete underwater dominance over the Soviets, a state of affairs that existed with Russia until today. After the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended in the late 1980s, this subaquatic expertise pivoted to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR missions. Los Angeles-class subs prowled the Persian Gulf during Operations Desert Storm and Iraqi Freedom, intercepting communications and launching Tomahawks. Later, Virginia-class boats shadowed Iranian submarines in the early 2020s. All the while, these combat missions have been continuously reinforced by rigorous training. Large-scale exercises like the RIMPAC regularly see US SSNs operating alongside Allied navies in complex anti-submarine warfare scenarios, refining tactics for future Pacific littoral engagements against China. And that might prove to be vital in a major kinetic confrontation with China. Shallow water and littoral operations are one area of submarine warfare where the gap between US and Chinese capabilities isn't quite as pronounced. In deep sea or blue water operations, no navy comes close to the US navies. In addition to its world-beating fleet of aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, the US also has a far greater network of military bases and installations distributed right across the planet. The US's estimated 750 to 800 bases don't just leave all of today's military powers in its dust. It's the largest military network in human history, far exceeding any other nation's overseas military footprint. The nearest rival is the UK, with around 145 overseas military installations. France and Turkey have around 30 to 50 each. Russia has an estimated 52, while China has 29. But Russia's are primarily situated in neighboring Central Asian republics and to its south in Syria and Armenia. China's forces are also concentrated in its vicinity, with only its bases in Djibouti and Cuba located in far-off parts of the world. By contrast, the US is literally everywhere, in every corner of every continent on the globe. So, while practically all other navies have been built with local defense in mind, the US Navy has been constructed to project power globally. China, by most accounts, is actively seeking to expand its navy into a blue water fleet that can challenge the US Navy globally, or at the very least, defend its massive cargo fleet anywhere if global shipping continues its current descent into lawlessness and piracy. However, this is a relatively new development in Chinese military doctrine, and it's unlikely to take less than a few decades to even start to catch up. Until recently, China's fleet was very much prioritized towards defending its waters, denying the US Navy's superiority and invading Taiwan, not projecting naval power globally. It's only really in the last decade or two that China's focus has shifted from coastal defense to power projection. And in that goal of defending itself against possible US aggression, China has shown many experts, and their war games have demonstrated, that despite its inferiority, the Chinese submarine fleet may be pretty effective. In particular, while they lack the advanced acoustics and sensors and superior firepower of their nuclear-powered US rivals, China's diesel-electric submarines could create some nasty surprises for an attacking US fleet. The weapons they wield may not be at the same level as the US's, but they still pack quite a punch. The YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile flies at Mach 3, around 2,300 miles per hour, with a 335-mile range. Its sea-skimming terminal phase may well present a challenge for US Aegis defenses. The Jin-class's JL-3 SLBMs carry MIRVs, bolstering nuclear deterrence, while the U-6 torpedo, modeled on the US Mk-48 torpedo, delivers a 450-pound warhead over 28 miles. Of course, that firepower counts for nothing if the submarines carrying them are audible to the US's sonar. However, in the shallow waters of the South China Sea and surrounding the islands of the first and second island chains, that equation changes. The region's 230-foot shelves and reef-strewn littorals scatter sonar. Picture SQS-53C pings bouncing off sprattly corals. These conditions favor the diesel-electric UN-class's AIP-driven Silence and 22-foot draft, making it ideal for lurking near disputed outposts like Fiery Cross. With an endurance of 8,000 nautical miles, it can stalk US carriers for weeks. Its YJ-18's prime for ambush. US Virginia-class boats, on the other hand, are built for 2,000-foot dives and lose some edge in these shallows. Their 33-foot draft risks bottom scrapes in shallower waters, although their BQQ-10 sonar compensates by passing cluttered signal returns where inferior Chinese sonars falter. However, beyond these shelves in the deep water, there's no competition. In the 3.1-mile Luzon Strait, for example, US nuclear subs have been shown to excel, with sustained 30-knot sprints and networked ISR with P-8 spotter planes enabling standoff strikes. Regular undersea warfare exercises, such as Black Widow 2025 held near Hawaii and Sea Dragon 2025 and Exercise Malabar 2025 held near Guam, fine-tune tactics and coordination with allies. This standoff projection, blending precision and persistence, keeps US dominance firmly intact where depth allows. But what they lack in technological power, China hopes to make up for with sheer numbers. China is attempting to close the gap by boosting submarine production. A UN-class submarine costs around $200 million, while a Virginia-class submarine costs well over $3 billion, meaning not only is China outproducing the US, but it's doing it far more cost-effectively. Another Chinese gambit in this regard is the development of submarine drones, or to be more precise, large unmanned underwater vehicles, or UUVs. It's unclear how much of a game-changer these might be, or whether China ever intends arming them with nuclear weapons to create an analogue of Russia's Poseidon UUV. They're currently conventionally armed and appear to be primarily used for tasks like surveillance and mine-laying. But at least in the meantime, China does hold the advantage here. In September 2025, the plan paraded its AJX-002 and HSU-100 extra large uncrewed underwater vehicles, or XXL UUVs, measuring 60 to 65 feet in length. Even larger models, measuring 135 to 150 feet, have been spotted on satellite imagery under construction near Hainan. These massive platforms are intended to rival conventional diesel submarines in scale, but operate without a crew. They're believed to be equipped for long-range missions, potentially carrying torpedoes, naval mines, or even launching smaller UUVs. Again, there's no evidence China intends to arm them with nuclear weapons, at least for now. Smaller models like the Keelan ARV, a hybrid autonomous remote-controlled vehicle capable of crawling on the seabed, and the Haishen 6000 AUV, capable of diving up to 3.7 miles, demonstrate a broad spectrum of capabilities. And many of these UUVs are already active. China has already deployed its Sea Wing and HSU-001 UUVs for surveillance, mine warfare, and intelligence gathering, with deployments observed in the South China Sea, Indian Ocean, and even the Pacific. Not to be outdone, the US has its own XL UUV program centered on the Boeing Orca. The Orca is an 85-foot, 85-ton autonomous diesel-electric submarine designed for long-range, months-long missions up to 6,500 nautical miles. Its 30-foot modular payload bay is capable of carrying up to 8 tons, including mines like the planned Hammerhead, smaller UUVs, sensors, or electronic warfare systems. That's more than a match for its Chinese counterparts. However, the Orca program has faced significant delays and cost overruns, to the tune of being 3 years behind schedule and $242 million over budget by late 2022. The first Orca was delivered in December 2023, with the second only scheduled for delivery in March 2026. Ultimately, autonomous submarines may change the undersea equation as dramatically as autonomous aircraft or drones have transformed war in the skies and on land. Ukraine's use of naval drones to terrorize the Russian Black Fleet in the Black Sea and the Shadow tanker fleet more broadly is a case in point. But for now, the US is the undisputed king of submarines. After all, a single Virginia-class SSN loitering off Scarborough Shoal could unleash 40 Tomahawks to gut a planned invasion fleet targeting Taiwan within minutes.
It's full-on panic stations in China. President Xi Jinping has just watched the military that he has spent decades building get the most brutal wake-up call imaginable. Xi never expected this. When the US started bombing Iran, he thought China was safe. But what Xi has seen terrifies him, because it tells the Chinese president one very important thing: China isn't ready. It isn't ready for the military might that the US has just proven it can bring to bear, which will terrify Xi, as analysts believe he'll be ready to launch his invasion of Taiwan in 2027. But China also isn't ready for the geopolitical storm that it would face if it ever went to war with the US. We'll be covering the geopolitical aspect later in the video, but on the military side of things, the US has shown us several things during its short war with Iran that will have Xi shaking in his boots. First up, the US has proven that it can blind the eyes of an entire nation ahead of its attacks. That's what it did in Iran, as intelligence analyst and cybersecurity expert Ryan Macbeth reveals in a video posted to YouTube. The US was able to coordinate air, space, and cyber actions designed to disrupt sensor networks, as well as command and control, leaving Iran with a reduced capability to see and coordinate and respond, Macbeth says. Indeed, the first few hours of the joint US and Israeli strikes in Iran were characterized not by the bombs and missiles dropping, but by a coordinated effort to shut down Iran's systems, thus improving the chances of the US finding its targets without Iran being able to do anything about it. Lawfare Media says these cyber operations were key to the early elimination of Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, as they allowed the US and Israel to determine when Khamenei would be meeting with key senior officials, providing the perfect timing for strikes. Other cyber and intelligence operations ensured that the US had shut down a huge portion of Iran's air defense network before it sent its bombers and fighter jets into the arena. By the time Iran was even able to think about a response, thousands of targets had been destroyed, and Iran was already on the back foot. We'll be coming back to the scale of America's attack in a minute, but in shutting down Iran's eyes and ears, the US showed China exactly what it would do in the event of a war between the two nations. This doesn't only matter for the power and scale of the US strikes, it's also a problem for responses. If you're a crew on an anti-ship missile team and nobody's on the other end of the phone telling you to fire and where to fire, you're not going to fire, Macbeth says. And that's the point of what the US did in Iran that Xi has to take very seriously. You can build one of the strongest arsenals of missiles, as China is believed to have done. On the intercontinental ballistic missile front alone, Newsweek says that China has 550 launchers and about 400 missiles. But none of that matters when command and control have been shut down so effectively that the operators at these sites, and China's many other launch sites, can't communicate with military leadership. This is bad news for Xi in a fight with the US. It's even worse for Xi when you bring Taiwan, which is Xi's most likely target, into the mix. As Macbeth explains, China's plan for Taiwan is less about landing soldiers on the beaches, though it will try to do that. The plan is to bombard Taiwan with missiles, and for that, command and control have to be working properly. The US proved in Iran that it can shut down all of that before it even launches an attack, and that is a brutal wake-up call for Xi. Now, we mentioned targets a moment ago. That brings us to the second issue that Xi faces after what the US has done in Iran: pure shock and awe. With Iran's eyes and ears shut down, the US overwhelmed Iran's entire military infrastructure. The US showed that it can scale up day one to strikes so massive that they hit around 1,000 targets right off the bat. After about a week of the conflict, Breaking Defense is reporting that the US has conducted more than 3,000 strikes against Iran, hitting 43 of its ships in the process. Beyond the command and control centers we've already mentioned, the US has hit Iranian drone and missile manufacturing and launch sites, to the point where, according to some sources, Iran's drone launches are now down 83%, and its ballistic missile attacks are down 90%, compared to the first attempts that Iran made to respond. This sheer scale is a message to anybody who may cross the US in the future. The US strikes on a scale that nobody thought possible. Instead of a hurricane followed by a tidal wave like an Operation Desert Storm, we give the adversary 1,000 tornadoes on the first night, is how Macbeth categorizes it. And he's right. The US has demonstrated its ability to coordinate its jets and bombers with its space, cyber, and naval divisions, which showcases the sort of combat-tested capabilities that China simply doesn't have. Xi may think that China could do something similar, but China's enormous military hasn't been tested at any point during the modern era. The US has proven what it can do in Iran, and that means Xi knows that the US could do it all again to China if he's foolish enough to launch an invasion of Taiwan that gets the US involved. There's a lot more, as we'll be covering as we move through the video. Next on the list is America's long-range stealth capabilities. Though the US is now taking a sledgehammer approach to shattering Iran using its old non-stealth bombers, the initial hours of the war saw the US deploy its B-2 Spirit stealth bombers. Those bombers conducted surgical strikes right under the collective nose of Iran's air defenses, which is impressive enough. However, it's the sheer range of this stealth assault that will have grabbed Xi's attention. America's B-52 bombers completed 37-hour round-trip flights from the continental US to Iran to carry out precision strikes against several of Iran's facilities during the initial hours of the campaign. They were kept in the skies due to the US having a large fleet of aerial refueling tankers. Think about what this means to Xi. He now knows that US pilots are trained to such a high level that they can fly for about a day and a half with no stops, still carry out their strikes perfectly, and then get back home. There is no China is out of range that comes into the equation here. If the US decides to bomb China, as it might in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, there's nothing that China can do about the B-2s outside of hoping that its air defenses, which have already been mitigated by the US strategy of shutting down China's eyes and ears, could do something about them. Does China have a similar capability? It has the H-20 possibly. That's a stealth bomber designed to rival the best that the US has, but Aerospace Global News reports that the bomber dropped off the radar, figuratively speaking, in 2025, and it will be at least a few years before it can pose any sort of threat to the US. And even if it was available today, we come back to the point we made earlier. The US just proved what its stealth bombers can do in Iran. Chinese capability is mostly theoretical right now, so Xi has to deal with the fact that he knows that the US has long-range stealth, but he isn't truly certain that he can say that China can match the US in that department. And somehow it gets even worse for Xi. So far we've covered how the US has proven itself time and time again on the military front. It can hit thousands of targets in a matter of days, deploy long-range stealth, and shatter the eyes and ears of an opponent. However, there's a far more existential threat that is presented to Xi by what the US has done in Iran, and it's something that we briefly mentioned earlier. Ali Khamenei is dead. That changes everything about how Xi has to approach any war that could potentially prompt US involvement. And by the way, there's a lot more where this came from, so if you're getting value from the military show, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. What the US has shown Xi in Iran is that it will target a country's senior leadership from the moment that a conflict arises. Macbeth explains, stating, "The initial wave was synchronized with an Israeli strike at Iran's supreme leader. The takeaway here is that US intelligence decides if it wants to help an ally find something that's extremely well protected. It can, at least sometimes." So that raises some interesting questions for Xi. Can China protect its senior leadership? Iran couldn't, and we know that Iran had a huge network of underground bunkers designed for that very purpose. China may have something similar, but it knows the US and Israel can hit them anyway. All it takes is for the US to learn about one meeting, one moment of exposure, and then it's done. Xi will be out of the picture, and he knows it. But it gets even worse for China's president. The US and Israel have shown that they're not stopping at the top of the food chain. Political and military leaders all across Iran have been eliminated in vast airstrikes targeted at the country, which means Xi can't even rely on others to continue his work if the US comes calling with missiles and bombs. As Sky News reports, Israel claims that about 40 of Iran's top military commanders were taken out of the picture during the initial wave of strikes with the US. Right now, Iran has already selected a new supreme leader. After a brief period in which a three-person interim council assumed the duties of leadership, the Assembly of Experts moved quickly to appoint Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But that just means the Assembly of Experts now has a big jar of paint and a brush ready to paint a target onto somebody else's back. If Xi went down to similar strikes, would anybody in China even want the job while the US is on the attack? What Xi is seeing in Iran is a coordinated effect to decapitate an entire country's regime, and it's working. For Xi, the timing couldn't be worse because he has been chopping away at the top of China's military structure for some time now. On March 3rd, the BBC reported that China had removed 3 experienced military generals, Gao Jin, Liu Lei, and Han Weiguo, from a top political advisory board. Just 3 days before that, on February 27th, the BBC also reported that China had removed 19 officials, including 9 who served in the People's Liberation Army, as Xi looked to consolidate yet more power. After what's happened in Iran, Xi might be looking at these moves as major mistakes. Experienced officials have been removed, likely to be replaced by toadies who'll do exactly what Xi tells them. That's fine for Xi while he's alive and in power, but what happens when he's gone, due to the US sending a bomb right into one of his bunkers? China's entire military and political structure collapses, just as we're seeing in Iran. Still, China has something going for it. Like Iran, China has a missile-based strategy that it can use to fend off the US, and there's no denying that China is stronger in this department than Iran. as it's been building massive missile stockpiles in preparation for its Taiwan invasion, as well as to defend itself against attacks. You mentioned China's ballistic missile stockpiles earlier. Iran has massive stockpiles of its own, with some in Israel believing the country was on course to amass 8,000 ballistic missiles by 2027, prior to the US and Israeli strikes. Taking out command and control centers has drastically reduced Iran's ability to launch, but it hasn't eliminated that ability entirely. Xi will be relying on that fact to prop up his own missile-based strategy. However, China will also need to defend its launch sites, as the US has shown a propensity for striking Iran's sites. For Xi's ambition of invading Taiwan, this is a very bad thing. That means those Chinese ballistic missile sites will need surface-to-air protection, Macbeth explains, adding, "That means fewer units can be deployed to Taiwan to actually cover the invasion. It also means that these ballistic missile units are a lot less mobile. China will get painted into a corner, just like Iran was on the surface-to-air missile front. It needs to keep moving its launchers because every missile strike attempted gives off a massive signature that can be used to target the launchers soon after. The problem this presents for China is that its launchers spend more time on the move than they actually do firing, which means Xi's missile capacity is degraded without the US even necessarily having to fire shots. Fear of the response would mean that China's past plans of overwhelming an enemy with missile attacks would have to be shelved in favor of less frequent strikes and a whole lot of movement. Plus, China offers up a lot of targets to the US. Beyond the 550 intercontinental ballistic missile launchers that we mentioned, Business Insider reports the Pentagon believes that China has 300 medium-range ballistic missile launchers. Add 150 launchers for ground-launched cruise missiles, 250 launchers for short-range ballistic missiles, and 300 for intermediate-range ballistic missiles, and you get a total of 1,550 ballistic missile launchers. That amounts to a lot of targets for the US to hit. For China, having so many launchers does mean that it will be able to keep up a missile-focused strategy longer than Iran. However, that strategy would be degraded constantly, as the US has shown that it prefers to strike the archer rather than the arrows. In other words, and we said the same about command and control centers, missiles don't mean much when you don't have launchers you need to send them flying. Add everything that we've covered up to now, and you get a whole lot of military challenges that now stare Xi in the face as he watches what the US is doing in Iran. China's president knows that making any moves that lead to US involvement would lead to his country facing the same shock and awe type of strategy. And though China is in a much better position to absorb the brunt of this strategy than Iran, there's another element that will have Xi shaking in his boots. Iran has shown Xi that the US taking the power-based approach to building global geopolitical influence has worked. In response to the US strikes on its territory, Iran has been attacking US bases and military-adjacent targets in the Gulf region. On March 8, CNBC noted that Bahrain, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and several other states that Iran classifies as allies of the US have been attacked with drones and missiles. This is a miscalculation by Iran. It's attempting to bully these states as its entire military infrastructure crumbles, and the approach could end up solidifying US allegiances in the Gulf region rather than ruining them. Iran is turning itself into a geopolitical martyr because it's trying to hurt the US by attacking other countries. Xi knows that China would find itself in a very similar position if it went to war with the US, as Macbeth explains. Within a few days of this conflict, more allies are starting to realize that Iran is an existential threat to the Middle East, and China should take notice of that, Macbeth says. He points out that the US military has bases in South Korea and Japan, along with rotational bases in Australia and the Philippines. Xi would have to strike these bases in an attempt to weaken the US attack should war ever come. But all that achieves is bringing those four nations into the fight, giving China an even bigger problem to deal with. Imagine that all of this happens as a result of Xi following through on his plan to invade Taiwan. What should be an invasion of a small island nation would lead to China fighting Taiwan and the US. And in attempting to battle back against the US, China invites more powerful nations into the war, all of which will oppose it. As for allies, Russia is thousands of miles away and may well remember that China hasn't directly supported it in its Ukraine invasion. Iran is already being turned into a non-factor, and China's approach of building geopolitical influence through investment isn't going to be enough to convince small countries to get involved in such a massive fight. What we see here are two divergent geopolitical strategies at play. The US is focused on might, as seen by the hundreds of military bases it's built around the world. According to Al Jazeera, the US has around 750 bases spread across 80 countries. China, on the other hand, has one publicly acknowledged military base outside of its own territory, which is in Djibouti, and serves more as a logistics base than anything else. China has instead focused on plowing billions of dollars into helping smaller nations develop, which is fine as a very long-term plan, but it's not going to do much for China in 2027 if it does choose to invade Taiwan and the US gets involved. What China has left itself with is a situation where it gets pinned into its own territory by a country that has bases in many major nations that surround China. And just like we see with Iran, those bases would be a target for China, which only stirs up geopolitical tensions more, resulting in a war that spirals well out of Xi's control. Perhaps the diplomat puts it best, as it stated on March 7th. Having tracked China's regional partnerships over the last decade, we have found that Beijing's influence consistently peaks at signing ceremonies and fades when security risks arise. Beijing has built a Middle East strategy centered on influence without military presence, the outlet reports. We're seeing that right now in Iran, as China isn't rushing to do much of anything to help what is supposed to be one of its more powerful allies. What message does that send to the many countries that are much smaller than Iran, militarily speaking, about what China would do for them if they got drawn into a war with the US? It doesn't send a great message, and it means that China's money-based strategy of influence pales in comparison to what the US offers its allies. Security and power are everything in a wartime scenario. China offers neither to its many partners and allies, and Xi knows it. What's happening in Iran has proven it. China's inaction speaks louder than any of the money that it distributes. Sooner or later, Macbeth says, China will be forced to strike a non-aligned nation in a war with the US, just as Iran has been. And when that happens, Xi will wake up to the fact that the US has allies that will fight. As for China, not so much. With nobody on his side outside of his own country, Xi is watching Iran and seeing the ghost of wartime future if he picks a fight with the US.
After tensions boiled for years, Pakistan has finally done the unthinkable. It has launched an all-out war against the Afghan Taliban, sparking a conflict that feels like it's edging us closer to World War III. As bombs drop in Ukraine, Russia, Iran, and in the US military bases throughout the Middle East, another region is on the brink of chaos as an open war develops between two terrifying powers. In what is the latest and perhaps most dangerous flare-up of tensions between Pakistan and the Taliban-run Afghanistan, a series of border conflicts has devolved into what Pakistan's Defense Minister, Khwaja Mohammad Asif, now calls open war, which he claims that Pakistan is willing to wage against the Taliban because it has run out of patience. How on earth did we get here? Why is this war happening now? And what does it mean for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the region at large? We'll be exploring the many answers to the latter two questions as the video progresses, so be sure to stick with us. But as far as how we got here, it all started on February 26th, when the Taliban's military arm launched a series of attacks on Pakistani positions across the Durand Line, which is essentially the border that separates Pakistan from Afghanistan. Winding about 1,600 miles through mountains and deserts, that disputed border has been the flashpoint for confrontations between Pakistan and the Taliban in the past, as you'll discover soon, and it served that purpose once again. According to the BBC, the Taliban offensive was launched at around 8 p.m. local time and ran across the border provinces near Kunar, Khost, Nangarhar, Nuristan, Paktia, and Paktika, several of which are home to Pakistani military bases. The Taliban claims that it launched its raids on these bases in response to Pakistan's February 22nd strikes against what Pakistan claimed were militant camps in Afghan territory, which CNN called at the time a serious test of an uneasy peace between the neighbors. February 26th saw that test end in failure. Afghanistan's Taliban attacked back. The Taliban border strikes led to an almost instant response from Pakistan, claiming that the Taliban had miscalculated and opened unprovoked fire on multiple locations across the northwestern province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Pakistan launched a series of bombing raids against what it claims to be Taliban positions in Afghanistan during the early hours of February 27th, which included several attacks against border provinces and strikes against targets in Kabul. CNN adds that Pakistan was also believed to have specifically targeted Kabul because it's the birthplace of Hibatullah Akhundzada, who is the secretive leader of the Taliban. Whether the strikes were designed to take Akhundzada out or if they were simply meant to be symbolic isn't yet known, though Pakistan's labeling its response to the Taliban's border attacks as Operation Righteous Fury suggests the former. If Pakistan did indeed intend to kill the Taliban's leader, there is no confirmation that it was successful. The Taliban certainly wouldn't confirm its leader's death, even if it had happened. In the wake of Pakistan's response, the Taliban spokesman, Zabihullah Mujahid, took to X to create a post that has since been deleted. In that post, he claimed that the Taliban had responded to these Pakistani attacks with strikes against military positions in Helmand and Kandahar, though how true this claim may be is up for debate, especially as the post claiming the strikes was deleted soon after it was posted. Pakistan has also claimed that Taliban drones have targeted 3 locations since the fighting began. 2 of those are military targets, including a military academy in Abbottabad and an artillery school in Nowshera. However, one of the Taliban's drones reportedly fell near a primary school in Swabi. If that drone was intended to strike the school, it would mean that the Taliban is targeting civilians, and the use of drones by the Taliban for military purposes is also unprecedented, as the organization was previously thought to only have access to civilian drones. Right now, the countries are engaged in tit-for-tat exchanges. Deaths are starting to mount up, though how extensive the casualties truly are is difficult to determine. CNN reports that the Taliban was claiming that Pakistan's strikes had killed 19 civilians and injured a further 26 as of February 27th. Supposedly, most of those casualties were women and children, though this claim may be a ploy by the Taliban to score some propaganda points. Each side has delivered its own figures of how many fighters have died. According to the Taliban, 55 Pakistani soldiers have died in the Taliban strikes, which have led the Taliban to claim that it has taken 19 posts from Pakistan. These gains were made with the comparatively modest losses of 8 Taliban fighters to death, along with 11 wounded. However, Pakistan's Prime Minister's spokesperson, Mosharraf Zaidi, paints a much different picture. He claims that 297 of the Taliban's fighters have been killed, along with over 450 injured as of February 27th. The truth is difficult to determine when both sides are making such wildly different claims. Adding to the confusion, most media outlets are adding a disclaimer to their reports, noting that they haven't been able to independently verify any of the figures that either Pakistan or the Taliban are sharing. What is abundantly clear so far is that it has been a bloody confrontation. Depending on who you believe, it was sparked either by a Pakistani attack on Taliban bases in Afghanistan or by a series of Taliban strikes along the border it shares with Pakistan. Either way, there has been around a week of fighting that shows no signs of coming to an end anytime soon. As CNN points out, Pakistan and Afghanistan have been here before. Since October, the 2 countries and their leaderships have maintained a very shaky ceasefire, which was signed in the wake of another deadly conflict. However, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, says that this October conflict primarily focused on the border regions. The strikes we've seen toward the end of February, particularly those conducted by Pakistan, seem to be venturing beyond those regions. In other words, what was once a border dispute, albeit a bloody one, has descended into the open war that Pakistan claims it to be. The obvious question has to be asked, why? We've already covered one of the reasons, which seems to be the spark that set the whole thing off. The Taliban in Afghanistan believes that Pakistan violated the ceasefire agreement between the 2 nations when it launched its strikes against the supposedly militant bases on Afghanistan's territory. Pakistan would claim differently, arguing that these bases were occupied by terrorists who have been operating in Pakistan. And that brings us to the reason behind the trigger point, or at least one of them. Pakistan accuses Afghanistan of harboring terrorists that have been wreaking havoc in Pakistan for years. According to Pakistan's leadership, the Taliban government in Afghanistan has been supporting anti-Pakistani terrorists, who Pakistan claims are carrying out a widespread campaign of suicide attacks across the country. The Taliban claims that this is nonsense and that the territory of Afghanistan isn't being used to present any sort of threat to another nation, which in turn leads to the Taliban's claims that Pakistan's military is doing little more than carrying out unprovoked attacks against Afghanistan's civilians. Again, it's tit for tat. Each claim by Pakistan is countered by a claim from the Taliban, and neither side is backing down. One thing is for certain, Pakistan has a point about terrorism in its territory, though it isn't clear how much of that terrorism is being perpetrated by the Taliban directly versus people who are operating individually or as part of sects that support the Taliban but have no direct involvement with it. We have seen a consistent increase in terrorist activity in Pakistan over the last few years. According to the US Department of State, the number of terrorist attacks in Pakistan, along with the number of casualties caused by those attacks, rose by 50% compared to the figures from 2022. The perpetrators of these attacks were varied, including local ISIS branches, the Balochistan Liberation Army, and the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP. Keep that last group in mind. We'll be coming back to the TTP later. By 2025, the South Asia Terrorism Portal, or SATP, along with the Institute for Conflict Management, ranked Pakistan second in its global terrorism index. The number of deaths caused by terrorist attacks in the country had risen to 1,081 over the year leading up to SATP's 2025 index, which it says was an increase of 45% over the previous year. The TTP was responsible for about half of these attacks, resulting in 558 deaths in 2024 alone. To Pakistan, these substantial increases in terrorist activity on its own soil can all be linked back to Afghanistan and its Taliban regime. Again, the Taliban denies this, but according to the CSIS, Afghanistan under the Taliban's rule has a track record of providing a safe haven to terrorists from groups like the TTP and Al-Qaeda. Furthermore, the sharp increase in violence within Pakistan coincides with the Taliban rising to power in Afghanistan back in 2021, when US forces departed from the country. So Pakistan may have a point on the terrorism front. However, it has more reasons for declaring open war on Afghanistan, one of which seems utterly insane. But before we get to those reasons, along with what's going to happen next, this is a reminder that you are watching The Military Show. We bring you the full picture, not just the headlines, so subscribe to the channel to stay ahead of the curve. Now, before we get to the craziest reason behind Pakistan declaring open war on the Taliban, let's come back to the Durand Line. We told you earlier that most of the fighting between Pakistan and the Taliban has taken place across this massive border, and there is a good reason for it. Both the Taliban and successive Afghan governments before it have refused to recognize the validity of the Durand Line for years because of how it was formed. According to the CSIS, the line was created back in 1893 as an attempt by the UK to shield the British Raj from the Russian Empire. When the UK created this line, it didn't consider how it would affect the Pashtun communities that live in and around the new border that it had created. That's important because the Taliban today is dominated by the Pashtun movement, which is likely what draws the group to dispute and fight across the Durand Line. Pakistan has had chances to smooth over this dispute, according to the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI. The fact that it hasn't could even be considered a diplomatic mistake, especially as the Durand Line was created by a country that is no longer operating in Pakistan and hasn't been for close to a century. Consistent refusals to do anything about the conflict engulfing this border had led to Pakistan creating what RUSI calls a Frankensteinian monster out of the Taliban. In other words, a group that Pakistan once supported is now responsible for many of the issues that have led to open war because Pakistan hasn't done enough to deal with the Durand Line issue. Again, Pakistan would surely argue this. It would claim that a border that has been in place for well over a century should simply be respected at this point, even if it breaks up the community that forms the backbone of the Taliban. As is so often the case, regional disputes are escalating into something far worse. And with that, we come back to what is perhaps the most insane reason for Pakistan's decision to declare open war, along with its constant fighting against the Taliban beforehand: India. Specifically, and as CSIS points out, Pakistan accuses the Taliban of being little more than a proxy for India. The basis for this claim seems to lie in the fact that India has provided humanitarian aid to Afghanistan while it was under Taliban rule, along with sending diplomatic contacts into the country. Pakistan's claim ignores the fact that India has historically aligned itself with groups that battle the Taliban, such as the Northern Alliance and the US. Still, some in Pakistan now claim that Afghanistan has become a colony of India. These include Khwaja Asif, the Pakistani defense minister we mentioned earlier, who took to X in the wake of the Taliban's bombings of Pakistan to claim that it was expected that peace would reign in Afghanistan once the Taliban took over and the US withdrew from the country. However, the Taliban turned Afghanistan into a colony of India. Pakistan made every effort, both directly and through friendly countries, to keep the situation stable. It carried out extensive diplomacy. However, the Taliban became a proxy of India, Asif declared. This is all very debatable, especially as India worked to maintain basic diplomatic ties with Afghanistan for far longer than the Taliban has been in power in the country. Some might argue that Pakistan is now using its war against the Taliban to score points against one of its major regional and geopolitical rivals. Still, with the reasons for the open war between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban covered, we move on to what happens next, and it's here where things get a little difficult. Pakistan said on February 28th that it would hold no dialogue with Afghanistan's Taliban regime in the wake of what has happened over the last couple of weeks, which suggests that the skirmishes and strikes that we're seeing right now are the first stages of a much larger war. If that war happens, Pakistan, at least on paper, is the much stronger force. That's according to both CNN and Global Firepower, which ranks military nations each year based on dozens of factors. According to Global Firepower, Pakistan has the advantage in almost every department. It has 660,000 active personnel in its military, compared to the 75,000 believed, because different sources stated plus 170,000 active personnel, to be available to the Afghan Taliban. Pakistan also has 550,000 reserves compared to the zero that the Taliban has, along with 500,000 paramilitary forces versus 90,000 in Afghanistan. Pakistan has a defense budget of more than $9 billion. Afghanistan only spends $145 million on its military per year. The Afghan Taliban also has practically no air force or land power, outside of about 4,000 armored vehicles compared to the 59,000 plus that Pakistan has, along with its 2,677 tanks and thousands of units of artillery. As a landlocked nation, Afghanistan also has no navy, so it's possible that Pakistan could use its fleet of 120 assets to launch attacks on the Taliban. CNN adds that what the Taliban has in terms of military assets amounts to little more than some Soviet-era helicopters and whatever the US abandoned when it withdrew from the country. Oh, and Pakistan has nuclear weapons. 170 of them, according to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Granted, Pakistan is unlikely to use these types of weapons against the Taliban, but the fact that it has them, on top of everything else available to the Pakistani military, suggests that any war should be a whitewash for Pakistan. But it won't be. At least Pakistan's victory wouldn't come easily if a ceasefire isn't declared. One of the reasons for this is the TTP, which you may recall we asked you to keep in mind earlier. That group, which operates inside Pakistan, is one of the terrorist organizations that Pakistan accuses the Afghan Taliban of sheltering. It's a claim that makes sense. The second T in TTP stands for Taliban, after all. And even though the Taliban has mediated between Pakistan and the TTP in the past, CSIS says that the Taliban tends to come out in favor of the TTP more often than not. Pakistan's TTP problem is that this is just the sort of group that feeds into the one tactic that the Taliban has that could mitigate all of Pakistan's massive military advantages: guerrilla warfare. There's a good reason why the US withdrew from Afghanistan, clearing the way for a Taliban takeover in the process. The Taliban is very good at conducting damaging warfare against enemies with limited resources. And in the TTP, the Taliban has a group that has professed allegiance, as CSIS notes, and is believed to have between 30 and 35,000 members per the United Nations. That's not enough members to engage in an all-out conventional war with Pakistan, of course, but there are certainly enough people for a guerrilla war inside Pakistan that sees terrorist activity escalate. Suicide bombings, ambushes, and the general wreaking of havoc against Pakistan's military bases could all be conducted by the TTP on the Afghan Taliban's behalf, weakening Pakistan from the inside as the war rages. The BBC adds that any war that occurs between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban will be far from conventional. Even as Pakistan has started to target Afghan government facilities with its strikes, the BBC notes that the extensive guerrilla warfare experience that the people whom the Taliban has placed into its government could pay off in a full-scale war. The Taliban wouldn't be trying to win in the conventional sense of destroying Pakistan's army. It would do what it did against the US. Even if Pakistan occupies Afghanistan, there will be no end to the conflict. The Taliban would splinter into hundreds of pockets all across the country, and with the help of the TTP inside Pakistan itself. Any victory that Pakistan achieves would come at a massive ongoing cost that it would be paying for years. Pakistan also has its economy to worry about, as highlighted by the Eurasia Group's South Asia analyst Pramit Pal Chowdhury, who says Pakistan cannot afford to go to war with the Taliban. Their economy is in tatters. Fighting a similarly conventional force might be possible for Pakistan due to the size and strength of its military, but fighting against one that Chowdhury labels essentially a coalition of militia as expensive and a long-term process that Pakistan is unlikely to be able to sustain. In short, neither side is in a position to roundly defeat the other, and that situation works for the Taliban far more than it does for Pakistan. Perhaps that's why other South Asian regional leaders are already calling for an end to hostilities. Iran was offering to mediate between the two sides when the latest hostilities broke out. However, how available that option might be now is up in the air that the US and Israel have launched their own campaign against Iran's regime, which has left the country's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, dead. The United Nations, China, and the UK have all called for de-escalation, as has Mujahid, the Taliban spokesperson, who said on February 27th that, "Now too we want the issue to be resolved through dialogue." But Pakistan has said no to dialogue, at least so far. And that leaves the situation in Southeast Asia on a knife edge. If Pakistan is serious about its cup of patience having run out, what we're seeing now may be little more than the calm before a massive storm that could engulf the entire South Asian continent in war. And if that happens, World War III may not be too far behind, as far too many countries have interests in that portion of the world.
The war in Ukraine has been one of the bloodiest and most brutal conflicts since World War II, with colossal numbers of casualties on both sides. Yet, all of that bloodshed and chaos could pale in comparison to what could unfold if China were to take the dramatic, irreversible decision to invade Taiwan. Indeed, the potential ramifications of such a conflict are almost unthinkable, not only for the two combatant nations themselves, but for the entire world. And it wouldn't take long for the rest of the world to feel the impacts of this war. Because China versus Taiwan will likely play out very differently to Russia versus Ukraine because of one simple but incredibly important factor: geography. Despite the more than 5,000 miles that separate them, there are some similarities between Taiwan and Ukraine. Both are democracies boasting strong national identities and their own unique cultures and traditions. Both are under the threat of a far larger authoritarian neighbours who believe they have the right or even the duty to seize their lands. Both are strategic hotspots too, with Ukraine effectively separating Russia from the NATO alliance in Europe, and Taiwan playing an enormously important role in Indo-Pacific security and trade. Both of these countries also, despite their best efforts, have far smaller and weaker militaries than their enemies, and have to rely on the support of allies across the globe to survive. But perhaps the biggest difference between the two is their geography. Ukraine is a large landmass, extending across 233,062 square miles, or 603,628 square kilometers. The vast majority of that land is flat, with around 95% of Ukrainian territory made up of plains, and while some of Ukraine's big cities are situated by its borders, many, including its capital Kyiv, are located dozens or even hundreds of miles inland, far from any potential invasion front lines. Ukraine also shares borders with no fewer than 7 different nations, including multiple NATO states. This has allowed millions of Ukrainian people to safely flee the country and seek refuge elsewhere, while also allowing for important supplies, including military equipment and humanitarian aid, to enter the country from NATO allies. Ukraine's distinctive geography and layout have dramatically influenced the way the war has progressed so far, and continue to shape the face of the conflict to this day. The country's relatively large size, for example, means that the front lines stretch for hundreds of miles, with forces able to retreat, regroup, and reposition as needed. Ukraine's military can also establish long supply chains across its territory, ensuring that frontline troops have what they need to get by. This in turn leads to the type of grinding attritional warfare we've seen so much of in Ukraine, where Russia's troops slowly struggle to gain even the smallest amounts of territory, and there's a lot of back and forth fighting over small settlements and abandoned border towns. Taiwan is totally different. For starters, it's an island, and it's a fraction of Ukraine's size, measuring up at just 13,976 square miles or 36,197 square kilometers. It's very densely populated too, with over 23 million people calling Taiwan home and around 90% of the country's entire population living along its western coast. Because unlike Ukraine, which is so vast, open and flat, Taiwan is a rugged and mountainous landmass, with some of the tallest mountains of East Asia stretching across its central and eastern regions. This means that much of Taiwan's infrastructure, including major cities, ports, power plants, data centers and air bases, are all clustered on the island's western coast, the same coast that directly faces the Chinese mainland. This changes the game entirely. Unlike the war in Ukraine, which involves 1,000-mile front lines and disparate combat zones, with vast swathes of open land for troops to fall back into, and neighbouring countries for refugees to flee to, a war in Taiwan would be much more compressed, both in space and in time. This is unlikely to be a long, drawn-out affair, with gradual grinding battles for the most minor patches of land. Instead, China versus Taiwan would be condensed and chaotic from day one, with major cities, including the island's capital Taipei, under threat from the very moment China decides to invade, and a real risk of huge numbers of civilian casualties in the early days and weeks. Now that's exactly the kind of scenario we break down every week here on The Military Show. So if you're finding this useful, hit that subscribe button. It's the best way to stay ahead of the curve as the global balance of power shifts. Now, let's get back to the battlefield. It's impossible to know exactly how the war would play out, but we can make an educated guess based on what we know about both sides' military capabilities and doctrines. Facing the incredibly difficult prospect of invading an island and crossing the 110-mile wide Taiwan Strait, China would need to strike fast and hard, most likely deploying enormous naval and aerial invasion forces to overwhelm the island's defences and establish some sort of foothold along the western coast as quickly as possible. Only then would China's People's Liberation Army, PLA, be able to push on and take control of Taiwan's cities and infrastructure. Of course, China has been preparing for this. It's built the world's biggest naval force, making the most of its enormous economic strength to invest heavily in unprecedented levels of shipbuilding. According to Global Firepower, the Chinese Navy now includes 3 aircraft carriers, 4 helicopter carriers, more than 60 submarines, 50 destroyers, 72 corvettes, 150 patrol vessels, 36 mine warfare vessels, and 47 frigates. And it's still expanding, with Chinese engineers hard at work on a 4th aircraft carrier as we speak. China also boasts one of the biggest and strongest air forces on Earth, with more than 3,300 assets in total, including over 1,200 fighters and close to 1,000 helicopters too. It also has some of the world's most powerful missiles, capable of striking anywhere in Taipei and dealing devastating damage. What's more, China has invested a lot of time, money and resources into strengthening its cyber warfare strategies and conducting military exercises, exploring every eventuality and plotting out the most effective ways to attack the island of Taiwan. It's even been seen working on brand new specialized landing barges that could aid in transporting troops and other equipment across the rough waters of the Taiwan Strait, as well as testing deep-sea cable cutters which could theoretically sever the island's communications with the outside world. In short, while we don't know exactly what China's plan is, its military has been working tirelessly to perfect that plan, and any attack on Taiwan would most likely be both swift and brutal, involving a mixture of targeted missile strikes, cyber attacks, naval blockades, airspace disruption, and additional operations aimed at getting troops, artillery, and other assets over the strait and into Taiwan's major ports and coastal cities with minimal losses and delay. This would not be a war of stages or gradual escalation. China will most likely throw everything it has at Taiwan in a very short period of time, which would invariably lead to huge casualties. Because, unlike in Ukraine, Taiwanese civilians would not find it easy to flee. Many would choose to stay in the homes they've known all their lives, and even those that choose to evacuate wouldn't have many options available, especially if China cut communications, controlled the skies, and set some sort of naval blockade around the island, effectively eliminating any way for people to leave. But Taiwan and its people would not simply roll over and wave the white flag when Chinese ships start heading their way. Just like China, they too have been preparing for this eventuality for many years, fine-tuning their strategies, investing in defences, and taking all available measures to prepare for war. Taiwan has also kept a close eye on events in Ukraine since the war there began back in 2022. Indeed, within a month of the conflict breaking out, the number of Google searches from within Taiwan related to the Russia-Ukraine war far surpassed those related to other important issues of the time, like COVID-19 vaccines and rapid tests, which were in short supply back then. Viewership also rose for TV programs and news reports related to the war, as the Taiwanese population sought to learn as much as possible about the kind of conflict that could someday break out in their own homeland. This led to some big shifts in public attitudes and government policies, with the government increasing their defense budget by 18% between 2022 and 2024, and establishing drone units within the army from 2025. Taiwan has also set up new training programs for army recruits related to drone warfare, anti-tank rockets, and shoulder-fired Stinger missiles. And polls show that more people than before are willing and eager to participate in emergency response and disaster relief training or to join civil defense organizations. Taiwan's military leaders have also undoubtedly learned a lot from observing events in Ukraine, and have been making their own plans to defend their territory from a Chinese invasion for many years now. They've evaluated the ways in which such an attack might unfold, kept tabs on Chinese military innovations and developments, identified the locations that the PLA would try to take control of first, and built an entire defense doctrine based around delaying and disrupting any attempted invasion as severely as possible. In the same way that Ukraine has always known it cannot defeat Russia in a one-on-one conflict, Taiwan knows it does not have the necessary military muscle to outmatch China. But that doesn't mean it can't deal heavy damage and slow China's progress long enough for allies to arrive on the scene and lend their aid. As such, Taiwan's tactics for defense largely revolve around the so-called porcupine strategy, which relies on the use of a multitude of small mobile weapons rather than large expensive platforms, effectively transforming the island into a porcupine-like structure, with a vast array of defensive quills like missiles, loitering munitions, and anti-ship systems dotted all around, all aimed at inflicting heavy losses and making the invasion as costly as possible for Beijing. Taiwan boasts state-of-the-art surveillance systems too, like advanced radars that are constantly monitoring the seas and skies around the island, ready to spot any incoming missiles and provide early warning. The Taiwanese military has also established strong cyber and information defenses, including redundant communication systems and counter-disinformation strategies to counteract China's destructive digital warfare. Through these investments and innovations, Taiwan has sought to deter China from invading. It's done everything it can to present itself as being almost impossible to attack, without the invading force suffering major losses. However, at some point, China may simply decide that the ends justify the means, and Beijing may be ready to accept those losses as long as it gets what it wants: the fulfillment of President Xi Jinping's long-running quest to reunify China and Taiwan at last. So, if an invasion began, there's no doubt that Taiwan would have strong systems in place to defend itself, but they may begin to buckle beneath the sheer weight of the invading force. The initial phase of the conflict would potentially be one of the bloodiest and most brutal the world has ever seen. The Taiwanese military would deploy whatever missiles, artillery and air defenses it has, concentrating its efforts in key port cities and coastal entry points, like ports, beaches, bridges and causeways, with one main objective in mind: buy time. It would be focused purely on delaying the invasion as long as possible, giving the rest of the world time to react, respond and send help. China, meanwhile, would deploy its vast naval and aerial forces, simultaneously launching cyber attacks and missile strikes with the exact opposite objective of Taiwan in mind. While Taiwan would focus on delaying and prolonging the initial stage of the conflict, China would want it to be over and done with as soon as possible, because once it gains some sort of foothold on the coast and can start funneling troops into the big cities like Taipei, the war would, to a certain extent, already be won. Beijing would simply be able to continue transporting soldiers and other assets over the strait, building a bigger and increasingly unstoppable force on the island to obliterate any remaining defenses, and with no available exit route, Taiwanese people would be faced with a grim choice between death or submission. Now, there's no way to predict any war, especially one like this, with so many variables. But the end result of those opening stages would ultimately boil down to which side has prepared and planned most effectively, with China's relentless attack coming up against Taiwan's porcupine defense, and vast numbers of both soldiers and civilians undoubtedly losing their lives in the process. The opening stages of the Russia-Ukraine war were horrific, with widespread civilian casualties, reports of mass war crimes, and scenes of unimaginable destruction. This would be worse. Both sides would suffer losses, and the extreme population density of Taiwan means that those losses would come thick and fast with the local population. Even if they sought cover in the various underground malls and other subterranean structures of Taiwan's big cities, they'd be at risk of near constant bombardment as Chinese missiles rain down from above and swarms of drones fill the skies. But it's what comes next that would truly make the China versus Taiwan war far worse than the war in Ukraine, as other countries around the world would likely feel the need to step up and enter the fray. Again, there are no certainties here, as even Taiwan's closest allies have expressed varying levels of support and commitment to defend the island over the years. With that said, several countries, including the United States, the world's biggest military superpower, have vowed to intervene and aid the Taiwanese people should they come under attack. Japan too could take military action against China or send support to Taiwan in other ways. It's unclear exactly how these countries would respond, as they have historically maintained a policy of strategic ambiguity, refusing to explicitly state what actions they would take if and when an invasion occurred. But both nations, especially the US, have the power to make a major difference in the conflict, which could quickly escalate out of control as other nations get involved. And because this would be such a condensed, concentrated conflict, decisions would have to be made quickly. It wouldn't be like Ukraine, where Kyiv's allies across Europe and North America have been able to afford themselves weeks or months to discuss and debate what type of aid to provide and how to respond to Russia's aggression. Countries would need to react far more quickly, with tight timelines and imminent deadlines, raising the risks of escalation even further. This is just one of the many reasons why a China versus Taiwan war is considered by many experts across the globe to be the most likely precursor to a Third World War. Because if China does take the step of launching its invasion, it won't want to stop until it achieves its objectives. If America then intervenes, supported by allies in the NATO alliance, it's easy to imagine how the situation might spiral. The likes of Russia and North Korea could come to China's aid, leading to the kind of conflict that would change the world as we know it for generations to come, with unimaginable loss of life and even the ever-present threat of nuclear devastation, as most, if not all, of the world's nuclear powers could be drawn into the battle. This, of course, is the worst-case scenario. There's still a possibility that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will not necessarily trigger worldwide conflict. Even then, even if China simply got what it wanted and seized control of the island in a matter of weeks, this would still have the potential to deal far greater damage to the world as we know it than the war in Ukraine. Not in terms of casualties, but in terms of economic damage. Why? Because Taiwan is the dominant force in one of the most important industries in the world, the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are critical materials that are used for making so many of the modern electronic components that power our world, from transistors to computer microchips and solar cells. Countless devices rely on these semiconductors, and Taiwan, primarily through its Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, leads the way in this field, producing the most sophisticated, compact, and high-powered chips for smartphones, computers, AI systems, and more. While other countries, including the US, have been working on improving their own semiconductor industries, there's no underestimating the importance of Taiwan in this sector. It's the only place in the world capable of making such advanced chips on such a massive scale. Any sort of disruption to the island's semiconductor industry would directly impact the production of consumer electronics, automobiles, medical devices, and military systems the world over. The war could, for example, lead to semiconductor infrastructure being decimated due to missile strikes and bombing runs, with the global chip supply collapsing as a result. China could alternatively intentionally avoid targeting Taiwan's chip facilities, instead seizing control of them, gaining immense economic power and influence as a result. Either way, the effects would be enormous, and ripples would be felt around the world as everyday electronic devices like smartphones, PCs, and data centers suffer sudden shortages, the pace of technological development slows to a grinding halt, the cost of cloud computing services skyrockets, new vehicle production drops dramatically, military and medical development programs are delayed, and the entire world becomes even more reliant on China than it was before. As stated, none of this is certain, and there's almost an endless amount of ways in which a China versus Taiwan war might play out. But in almost any one of those possible scenarios, the costs would be enormous, with many lives lost, valuable infrastructure destroyed, international alliances tested, and the future of the world as we know it irrevocably altered forevermore. Now, learn more about how Taiwan might be able to defend itself long enough from a Chinese assault to prevent Beijing from achieving its objectives in this video. Or check out this video to see how the US is already preparing a secret weapon that could crush China's invasion attempt before it even begins. And to make sure you stay informed and up to date on the latest military news from China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine, and beyond, subscribe to our channel today.